Hi, I'd like to introduce our presenter from Multimedia Web Design and Development, Tyler Varsell. She's very fortunate in a research sense that a new version of HTML5 came along right when she was looking for a thesis project, and I had done some materials on this, written a book on it this summer, and one of the things that I noticed was that different implementations of HTML5 were coming about, and so what Tyler did is she systematically went through and examined how the different elements were implemented.
So yeah, basically the goal of this research project was really to determine the extent to which browsers are adopting and have already adopted HTML5. And this is really critical in sort of examining the evolution of the language as well as its future implementation. And the introduction of HTML5 is really demonstrating a progress towards practicality, interactivity, and simplicity of web markup to sort of correspond with a lot of evolving web trends and web standards. And so I'm going to begin with going over a few of the major features of HTML5, and there really are several, so I can only really highlight a few of the more significant ones, starting off with a transformation of multimedia content on the web with the new audio and video elements. Before HTML5, developers had to rely on various third-party plugins such as Flash or QuickTime in order to successfully embed multimedia, which is becoming especially problematic recently, especially with the iPhone and iPad lack of support for Flash. So now standardized audio and video elements as well as embed are making it much simpler to embed multimedia content on the web. And I just wanted to show you quickly what the code looks like before and after HTML5 in terms of just including a simple video file on a website. And obviously before HTML5 you can see it's so much more extensive, and after it's really just a matter of one line of code, which is really making it much lighter, much simpler, and could really enhance the use of audio and video on the web. And because they're native to the browser, audio and video come with their own controls interface, and this basically just shows aesthetically how the audio controls differ from browser to browser. Internet Explorer not included because it didn't work in Internet Explorer. Or you can also build your own controls through JavaScript with a few of the new HTML5 events as well. So it's really the multimedia, the new multimedia elements in HTML5 are really very powerful and really flexible as well. The development of HTML5 is also sort of expanding on the idea of a more functional, more dynamic graphics on the web with the support of scalable vector graphics, or SVG, as well as a newly introduced canvas element, which essentially represents a drawing surface where one can literally draw using JavaScript. And this is really significant because as opposed to static graphics, SVG and canvas can be really easily changed by just altering the code attached to them, which is especially useful in creating graphs and diagrams and things that need to be updated frequently, as opposed to having to recreate images. And there's this really amazing example of Canvas already in use that I just wanted to show really quickly. And this is a Canvas-based experiment that allows you to drag points on this interactive cloth. So you can just pull it and drag it. And this was done entirely in HTML5 with the Canvas element. I think this was a Google Chrome experiment. So yeah, it's a lot of fun to play with. But it's just one example of a lot of the really complex and powerful tools that are really transforming the use of graphics on the web. And another major extension to HTML5 is through Web Forms 2.0, which is basically a revamped specification of how web forms are handled. And I mean, forms are really everywhere on the web. We use them all the time. So this is also especially significant since HTML5 is presenting a much more powerful way of building forms that are not only more functional and user-friendly, but also introduce greater flexibility in rendering across a variety of different browsers and devices. And I'm going to be going over a few examples of these new form features in a little bit. Finally, HTML5, or greater mobile support is another major aspect of HTML5 that's worth noting. And as mentioned earlier, especially with Apple's lack of support for Flash in the iPhone and iPad, HTML5 is already being viewed as an improvement to Flash capabilities, although it doesn't seem likely that Flash will completely be replaced by HTML5 by any means, but it's already really demonstrating a lot of key advantages that are worth paying attention to, particularly in relation to mobile applications. For example, with the recent escalation of web browsing via smartphones, HTML5 has a new offline capability, which is already being utilized by Google. I think their VP of engineering recently demonstrated a new private version of Gmail, which that uses HTML5 offline storage tools, which offer offline access to Gmail in both the iPhone and Android. So you'd be able to check your email through Gmail, even if you didn't have an internet connection, which is something that's definitely probably huge with a lot of the smartphone users today. So these really just represent a handful of a lot of the major additions to HTML5 that I examined in my research, and are really telling of sort of what's to come in terms of evolving web trends and technologies. And for my hypothesis is basically that based on the specifications of HTML5, all browsers will fully and successfully implement World Wide Web Consortium standards as specified in the W3C working and editor's drafts, which are basically comprehensive specifications of all the features and all the components of HTML. So this hypothesis basically just served as a testing platform to evaluate the results against. And what's really interesting about the methodology of this research project in particular was that the instrument used to test the implementation of HTML5 was also a significant part of my research. So I developed a web page to test the major elements, attributes, form features, and events of HTML5. So this was a big part of my research, and the project as a whole was basically a combination of a project centered around this testing device, but also a comprehensive paper further describing the research and all the components of HTML5. So now I'm just going to go over a few of the major HTML5 features that I tested with my testing device. Beginning with SVG, which I mentioned briefly earlier, and I really had two different applications of SVG. The first, well, the blue circle is not an image. It was created using the SVG element itself. And I mean, this is really probably the most boring and simplest use of SVG that you can do. But I also created an SVG image file in Illustrator that has an extension of .svg. So just like you would save an image as .png or .jpeg. But since it is a vector image, it can really be resized to any size without reducing the quality of the image itself. And this actually doesn't implement in Google Chrome. And I think it has to do with SVG is also related to a new font element for SVG. And if it's not implemented, it will just display this sort of default font. So it's not working in Google Chrome, but this is something that's very new and sort of really huge in the evolution of web graphics on the web. Since vector images are used a lot in print design, but we really don't see them a lot on the web. So this is something really new and something I'm especially interested in as a media arts concentration. And I also wanted to show you content editable, which is a new attribute in HTML5, which basically allows you to delete, add, move around text, just like you would in any word processor. And this can be useful in websites like Wikipedia, where content is user-generated, or for allowing visitors who aren't HTML savvy to edit their own content. So this is one of my favorite new features of HTML5. And I also wanted to just go over a couple of the new form features, which I talked a little bit about before, especially color and date, which right now only work in the browser Opera, which most of you might not have even heard of. A very small percentage of users actually use Opera. But once they're successfully implemented, they will enable a drop-down color picker for color and a drop-down calendar for date, where you'd be able to select a day, week, month, I think time zone even. So it's customizable, but you don't need to have any programming or code attached to it. it's native in the element itself. So this is something really nice in improving form usability. And there's also a new required attribute, one of the new form features, which is making it really a lot simpler to define required fields without requiring a lot of extensive coding or programming behind it. And my example is really simple. The border just changes from red to green once you begin typing in the text field, just to show that that field requires input. So form features such as these are really attempting to improve the user experience with forms and completing forms on the web. And the last new feature of HTML5 I just wanted to show is the new drag and drop capabilities, which are a really important addition to HTML5. And my example is, again, very simple. It just displays the title of the photograph when the thumbnail is dragged into this gray box. But there really are so many things you can do with drag and drop. And one nice example that I found was sort of a simulation of a shopping cart, where the items are dragged into the shopping cart and the prices automatically are totaled, which is something we don't really see too often, but it could hint at one possible future use of drag and drop capabilities. So in terms of the results, where are we here? For the testing process, the new features of HTML5 were tested in the 5 major browsers: Firefox, Google Chrome, Internet Explorer 9, which is the most recent version of Internet Explorer, Safari, and Opera. Primarily on my own computer, which has a Vista operating system, but I also tested in Windows XP, Windows 7, as well as on a Mac, an iPhone, and Android platforms to get a variety of results. And to easily visualize the results of the implementation, really simple charts were created with column headings representing each of the 5 major browsers, and each row corresponding to all the new HTML5 features. So basically, the cell was shaded green if it was successfully implemented, no if not, and yellow if it was partially implemented or not really in the way expected. And additional comments were added to further explain the results. And overall, Google Chrome implemented the most HTML5 features with 38 out of 46, which is really pretty good. Firefox and Safari basically tied for second, followed by Opera, and then finally Internet Explorer implementing the least amount of features, which wasn't really a surprise. But I actually was kind of surprised at how close a lot of the results were. But it's really important to note that these results are very transitory. They're constantly changing. I definitely found this during my own research. As browsers would come out with new additions and upgrades, I was constantly having to retest, and this affected the results, so I was always having to change the results on that. So, oh, and also it was interesting for the mobile devices. I found that I tested on Android and iPhone, and the results were almost identical between the two systems. But something that was also interesting was that neither video or audio worked on either smartphone, which was kind of counterintuitive to what I had been researching about video and audio, especially how they're supposed to take over mobile devices. So that was something that was a little surprising to me. But overall, there was really sort of a lack of consistent and thorough implementation, proving the hypothesis wrong, which wasn't really a huge surprise. And HTML5 really isn't expected to be completely finalized for at least another 10 years, but the draft was released in 2008, which sort of led to like a scramble of the developers to begin its implementation, which definitely has a lot to say for the inconsistent results that I found. So basically, implementation is a really ongoing and dynamic process that will continue to develop in the future. And although it's inconsistent now, I think HTML5 is really a huge factor in how web trends are continuing to develop. So that was it.